remember, most important thing is see there are actually huge. There are actually many enzymes present over there. Now, for many people, it becomes very difficult that how to remember so many examples and stuff. But actually, it's very simple. I'll give you the idea. What you do is first you consider that what are the things that we eat. The first thing that you eat, that is going to be the carbohydrate. Next thing that you eat, that is going to be the fat. And next thing that you eat, that is going to be the protein. And next thing that you eat, that is the nucleic acid. Okay, anything else you eat? We don't eat anything else. Okay, so these are the few things that we normally eat. So over here, as far as the carbohydrates are concerned, so what do we do over here is we have got something called as amylase. Okay, so over here there is present something called as pancreatic amylase. Pancreatic amylase. Now you remember in the mouth there was in the mouth, you see there was digestion of the starch was going on, and starch was getting converted into those maltose, isomaltose, and those nimidextrin. So over here also we see that the other carbohydrates which are present, okay, that we eat normally, so they are going to get converted into the monosaccharides or disaccharides. Okay, mono or disaccharides. Okay, so they are the polysaccharides which are present. They get converted into monosaccharides or disaccharides. Then remember, as far as the fat is concerned, so here we take three types of things. Number one is we take something called as triglyceride. Another thing that we can take, that is going to be, you can say, those steroids, sterol. So for triglyceride, remember, it can be either digested by lipase or it can be digested by colipase. Okay, and I have already told you liver helps in emulsification. Do you remember that? Liver breaks down larger fat droplets into smaller fat droplets, and that is called as emulsification. And then triglyceride is digested by lipase and the colipase. And after that, when sterol comes up, so sterol, we have got another enzyme called as cholesterol esterase. Okay, there is this enzyme present called as cholesterol esterase. Okay, and all of these, they are going to break it down into fatty acid and glycerol. Now, when it comes up to protein, now here remember, protein is a long chain. Now, whenever we talk about protein as a long chain, remember, either you can cut in the ends of the chain or you can cut in the middle of the chain. Okay, like if there is a long chain, suppose, so you can either cut in the ends of the chain, like over here, or you can cut in the middle of the chain, like over here. So imagine if you are cutting at the middle of the chain, then you will be called as endopeptidase. Since you are cutting the peptide chain, peptide bond, so it is peptidase. Ase, wherever it is written, always remember wherever the word ase is written, ase means it is enzyme and it is breaking. And whenever we talk about other than ligase, of course, that's the exception. Other than that, wherever you see the ase word, it means it's an enzyme and it is digesting. Okay, and whenever we talk about breaking the peptide bond, it is peptidase. And whenever we say that you are going to cut it within, so it is endopeptidase. Easy. So over here you will see that there is endopeptidase. So who can tell me what should these be called when they're cutting on the outer side? What do we call them? Any such idea? Correct. Neha has given a correct answer. Great. Titrina says ecto, but yes, Titrina, well tried, though that is not the correct answer, but well tried. And Hosaif has given correct answer, Adrija has given correct answer. So remember, it is exopeptidase Vitan. Okay, whenever they cut outside, it is going to be called as exopeptidase. Rajdeep, we are discussing peptide bonds, so you should say peptidase instead of nuclease. Nuclease doesn't, destroy the peptide bond. So over here, like I give you the idea that pepsin that we discussed, that is basically a endopeptidase only. Here, what do we have? Achha, chalo, I'll write it. at the bottom a little bit, so that we get space. Exopeptidase. So remember, when we talk about endopeptidase, here we have got two such enzymes present over here. Number one, we have got something called as trypsin. Okay, trypsin. Actually, it is present in the form of trypsinogen. And another one is, chymotrypsin. Actually, this is also present in the form of chymotrypsinogen. So, in the duodenum, the cells of duodenum, they express a special enzyme which is called as enterokinase. Okay, there is a special enzyme called as enterokinase, which converts trypsinogen to trypsin. And trypsin, I guess everybody is understanding this thing, handwriting? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and remember, chymotrypsinogen in the same way is converted by that trypsin into chymotrypsin. So trypsin converts chymotrypsinogen to chymotrypsin. That is not the only function of trypsin. Trypsin also digests the protein into peptides. Okay, protein gets digested by trypsin into peptides. Same is true for the chymotrypsin. Chymotrypsin also digests the protein into peptides. All right. Like last class we discussed, no, that pepsin is not present in as pepsin. Pepsin is present in the form of pepsinogen. So in the same way, here also that same thing happens. Understood, everyone? Okay, I guess everybody has understood this. So remember that, all right, all right. So over here, the next thing that we discussed, that is about the exopeptidase. So as far as the exopeptidase is concerned, remember that it will be cutting outer side. Now we have discussed already that there is a amide group present. So remember, there is going to be an N terminal, and then there is a carboxylic group present. So naturally there is a C terminal present. Now remember, here there is an enzyme which is going to be called as carboxypeptidase. So who understands the meaning of it rapidly? Anybody who understands the meaning of it rapidly? Carboxypeptidase. It seems no one is understanding the meaning rapidly. Correct. Josaifa has finally given the correct answer that if it is carboxypeptidase, that means it is going to cut it from the C terminal side. Correct. So naturally, you understand even this is also present in the form of pro-carboxypeptidase, which gets converted into carboxypeptidase. Yes, Titina, correct. So everybody understood about the protein digestion part. Now, as far as the nucleic acid digestion is concerned, so remember here there is nuclease present. So DNase, RNase, okay. These are nucleases present who break down the nucleic acid into nucleotides or nucleosides. So, if you read it blankly, then you will see there is number one pancreatic amylase, number two lipase, number three colipase, number four cholesterol number five trypsin, number six chymotrypsin, okay, then number seven procarboxypeptidase, number eight DNase, number nine RNase. Later on, you will learn that there is another enzyme called elastase is present. So many people think that oh my god, there are 10 enzymes present over here. How to remember? But if you remember in this way, do you think remembering this is very difficult, or you will be able to remember all these enzymes? All right. So, that's the point that I'm trying to clear out over here, that, everything is all about, technique. So how you learn it. Okay. There can be things which are very difficult. It can look very difficult, but actually, most of the time they are not that difficult. Anyways, so once we are done with all these things, all these enzyme stuff, so after this we can discuss about the absorption process. So simple way. I'll go to the next page. So here, remember, I will talk about those brush border cells. You remember? You remember the villi structure? So if you look at the topmost brush border cell, then you will realize. Who can tell me what is this? Those people who remember villi, let's see who can actually correlate. Bitan, we are discussing about the digestive system. Na? So over here, remember, as far as this carbohydrate is concerned, so remember carbohydrate includes, I'll put a thing over here. Let's say there's this receptor present. Okay. So glucose and amino acid. Okay. Glucose and amino acid. Remember, Titina, they have actually a co-receptor, or their receptors. The receptors of glucose and amino acid has a co-receptor for sodium. Okay. And remember, for this receptor, sodium enters because of passive, or sodium enters passively, but amino acid and glucose, they enter actively. All right. So remember, sodium enters passively, amino acid and glucose, they enter actively. Clear, everyone? Understood? So sodium enters passively and amino acid and glucose enters actively. Now, whenever we talk about the fructose, this was about glucose. Now, if we talk about, say, fructose and let's say galactose. So if we talk about fructose and galactose, so you will see that they enter over here through facilitated diffusion. Okay, fructose and galactose enter via facilitated diffusion. And after doing this, they will be passing to the bloodstream. Okay, amino acid, glucose, fructose, galactose, they will all pass through the capillaries. Now, over here, as far as the triglycerides are concerned, that is fat. So they break down into fatty acid and glycerol, and they enter separately. Okay, fatty acid and glycerol, they enter separately, and over here they enter into, like, all these fatty acid and glycerol, they form triglycerides again. Now here, I guess everybody knows that here there is present Golgi apparatus. In every cell there is Golgi apparatus present. So what does this Golgi apparatus do? Golgi apparatus forms a coating around this triglyceride. So triglyceride is present over here, and there is a proteinaceous coating around it. And this structure is called as what, This structure is called as chylomicron. Now this chylomicron, it gets liberated first, of course, into the bloodstream, but gradually it is going to enter inside the lacteal. So this is the way in which absorption takes place. So everybody clear how the entire digestive system works? How, starting from you intake the food, okay, after that you digest the food and the food gets absorbed. Assimilation wala is not a part of zoology discussion. That will be discussed in another, you can say, chapter, which is called as cellular respiration, but it comes under the botany department. So they're going to teach you that way. So everybody clear with this? All the structures of the digestive system, all the glands of the digestive system, the digestion process, as well as absorption process. All right, no confusion. Shall we proceed ahead? All right, great. So now we move on to the next topic, and the next chapter is going to be respiratory system. Okay, so as far as respiratory system is concerned, remember, here we have to learn few things, but which should be crisp and clear things. First of all, the respiratory system wala funda, the structures are known to everyone. So first of all, the air enters the nose, so it passes through the external, or the nostrils. Nostrils are called as external nares, and after that it is going to enter into the nasal chamber. Now inside the nasal chamber there are present certain features. Yes, Devadip, of course. So here there are present certain features in the nasal chamber. Like you will see that there are some certain things called as, what do you say? There are some bony plates. Okay. They are the bony plates. So these bony plates, they have got various names. Okay, like there is a, they are called as concave. Okay, I'll write over here only common one, concave, but there are of actually three types. Okay, so there is a, superior nasal concave, there is a middle nasal concave, then there is the inferior wala nasal concave. Okay, in this way there are various concave present. Always remember that these are thin, very thin bony plates which are present over here, so they are called as the concave. And inside, what is their job? Their job is to humidify the air, warm the air. Okay, so that we are homeothermal, so we like to regulate our body temperature. So proper temperature wala thing enters over there. Okay, so that is called as concave. Then there are some hair cells also present. Same function: humidification, okay, filtration, and making it warm. Okay, three functions. Now from the chamber, the air is going to enter, pass through the, there is a posterior nostril present over there. Like, there should be some opening posteriorly. So those are called as the internal nares. We call them internal nares. Now through the internal nares, it is going to enter into the nasopharynx. Okay, and from the nasopharynx, it is going to pass through the oropharynx, and then it is going to pass through the laryngopharynx. So there are three parts of the pharynx. In digestive system, we mention only the oropharynx, but there is also a laryngopharynx present. Now, this structure you need to know properly. Always remember that here a bone is completely the laryngopharynx you need to know, because we are discussing respiratory system here. So remember that in laryngopharynx, a bone is also responsible for all these things. Let's say I'll show it to you from the front side. So there is this beautiful bone present. The peculiarity of this bone is that this bone does not articulate to any other bone. This is the only bone in our body which does not articulate to any other bones of our body. So this bone is called as hyoid bone. You will see all the bones, they are none of them are floating. Every bone is connected to every bone in some way or the other. But every bone is connected. But this is the only bone which is sort of floating in nature. It is called as hyoid bone. Now beneath this, you will also see that there is present such a type of, oops, sorry. Here there is present, you can say such a type of cartilage. Okay, the cartilage looks somewhat like this. I'm trying to give you a 3D impression so that you can have an idea about it. Are you getting this folding behind? This is the back side. Okay, so this is how this cartilage looks like. So this is called as the thyroid cartilage. Okay, and at the bottom side here, anyone who knows what is this cartilage? It is called as, okay, this is the cricoid cartilage. Now remember, in between these, like the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage, there is present the membrane. So since here there is a membrane present, we call it as the thyrohyoid membrane. So here there is this membrane present, which is called as the thyrohyoid membrane. And in the same way, even here there is present another membrane. It is called as the cricothyroid membrane. So there is a thyrohyoid membrane, and then there is a cricothyroid membrane present. Now over here, this entire thing, okay, see, this is like, look at the pointer. If you look over here inside, yes, Neha, okay, so Neha wants me to write the names, so I'll write it. This one is called as thyrohyoid, and this one is cricothyroid. Now, if you look at this area where I'm showing the pointer, inside the membrane, do you see it is actually a hollow tunnel? It is like a hollow space. Like if you put in some stick from here, you understand it will pass through and through this. So this is the aperture. Do you understand that this is the aperture actually? You get my point? Yes. This aperture is called as glottis. Okay, this aperture is called as glottis. 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 All right. Now, over here, Whenever we talk about this glottis, you will see that this glottis is actually covered by a flap-like structure. Okay, this glottis, very good, Samira. So this glottis is covered by a flap-like structure made up of elastic cartilage. So it is called as epiglottis. Okay, yes, correct. It's covering, it's above the glottis, so we call it epiglottis. So actually, what is the basic funda over here? The basic funda is very simple. That normally, normally when we are present, we are speaking, we are chatting, we are talking, we are doing nothing, we are meditating, we are breathing. In all these cases, the epiglottis remains open and it allows the air to pass through it. And whenever we are chewing, whenever we are eating something, at that time, this epiglottis is going to get closed and the food will be going not inside the windpipe, but it will go inside the food pipe. So this is the basic idea of this glottis, epiglottis, and all this stuff. Understand the role? Because see, whenever we talk about this oropharynx and laryngopharynx, like if you look at these two, so whenever we talk about this oropharynx and laryngopharynx, they are basically having a common opening. So it becomes a little bit of judgmental issue when we have to decide ki, now air needs to pass in. Acha, now we are eating food, so food needs to pass through the food pipe. Now air is passing, so air needs to pass through the windpipe. So it is the epiglottis who acts like a traffic police over there. Clear? Now, in the posterior side, here in this diagram, it is not visible, but in the posterior side, there are more cartilages present. So I'll tell you, if I draw this same picture from the posterior side, how will it look like? See, I'll try to show it. You will see that this looks somewhat like this. Okay. In this sort of manner. I'm not so good at this artwork, but I guess everybody can understand this. And this is going to be the thyroid cartilage. And you see this is going to be that bone, the hyoid bone. And this is going to be the cricoid cartilage. And then here there will be present, okay, let me first draw this structure. So here there is going to be present this. What is this? It's epiglottis. The epiglottis will be present over here. Now what I'm trying to say is that here there will be present few more cartilage. One such cartilage which is present over here is this cartilage. So this cartilage is called as the arytenoid cartilage. Okay, these are two cartilages. Everybody can appreciate in this Wahiya picture. Can you appreciate that there are two cartilages present over here, the green colored one? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, remember it is called as arytenoid cartilage. Okay, this is called as arytenoid, not RI. It is arytenoid cartilage. Okay, and then you will see that here there are present some more cartilage. Like these cartilages are very small and can't be visible here. Like one I'm showing it like this, and another one I'm going to show it like that. Yes, Titina, two pairs are there. So one, let's consider it to be like corniculate cartilage. It is corniculate cartilage, and the other one is cuneiform cartilage. Okay, that cuneiform cartilage. Now, can you tell me, by any chance, can you tell me, so many cartilages we have discussed, isn't it? We have discussed about the thyroid cartilage. We have discussed about hyoid is of course a bone, so uski baat nahi karni. We have discussed epiglottis. Okay, and we have also discussed which one? Cricoid cartilage. So tell me something. Okay, tell me something. How many of these are paired cartilages. Who can tell me how many of these are paired cartilages? Tell me rapidly. 1 minute, 1 minute. Sorry, no, not even one. 30 seconds. Okay. Which one are they? Which one are they? Don't just write numbers. Okay. Numbers is okay. Which one are they? Write that. 30 seconds I'm giving you. 29, 28, 27, 26, 25, 24, 23, 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So I guess everybody has given correct answer. That cuneiform is a paired cartilage, corniculate is a paired cartilage, arytenoid is a paired cartilage. Okay, so there are three paired cartilages present, and then we will see epiglottis is an unpaired cartilage. Okay, and we will see thyroid cartilage is unpaired, and we see cricoid cartilage is also unpaired. So remember that there are three paired cartilages and there are three unpaired cartilages. Yes, Sushovan. So everybody got this idea? So total we see there are 9 cartilages present, isn't it? So yes, correct, Etienne. So over here, everybody has got a clear idea about what is this entire thing happening over here. What is larynx actually? Now, post puberty, since we know in males, bones and cartilages both grow. So here also some sort of growth takes place. Okay, in this area, some sort of growth takes place. Actually, the entire area growth takes place. That is why voice changes. But here, a little bit of growth takes place, and this is visible from outside the growth, and it is called as Adam's apple. Okay, this is known as Adam's apple. And after this, you will see that here there are some, those some rings present, and all these cartilages, most of them, like I said, epiglottis is made up of elastic cartilage, but other than that, most of these cartilages, they are part of tracheal rings. So which one, what do you think, which type of cartilage should be present over here? Who remembers my teachings? Let's see. Very good. Snigdha remembers it, that it is going to be hyaline cartilage. Correct. So you just remember these teachings and it will help you a lot, hopefully. So these are hyaline cartilages. Okay, so these are also, there are also 15 to 20 such tracheal rings made up of hyaline cartilages which are present over here. And you see posterior diagram is different from anterior diagram. Why? Because the rings are C-shaped. Okay, rings are C-shaped, and they are incomplete posteriorly. They are complete anteriorly. That is why it's such a picture. After this, so naturally after larynx, you understand we get the trachea where 15 to 20 such rings are present. Now remember, at the fifth thoracic vertebrae, okay, at the fifth thoracic vertebrae, how do we write it? We write it in this way. Okay, fifth thoracic vertebrae, the trachea is going to bifurcate into bronchi. Okay, then it will bifurcate into primary bronchiole, then secondary bronchiole, then tertiary bronchiole, and then terminal bronchiole. Okay, so larynx will divide into trachea, then there are bronchi, then there are primary bronchiole, then there are secondary bronchiole, then there are tertiary bronchiole, then there are terminal bronchiole, and finally there is going to be the alveoli. So here you will find that there is present alveoli like this. Now remember, whenever we talk about these alveoli, so here there are some cells present. Okay, so these cells which are present over here, the general cells, so we call them as pneumocytes. But other than pneumocytes, we see here there are present some different type of cells as well. Like here there is different type of cells present. Now these cells, naturally we have to call them also as pneumocytes. But then there is a difference. What is the difference? These cells which I have shown over here, these cells, their job is primarily, yes Neha, we are discussing alveoli only. So their job is primarily to release surfactant, not surfexel. It is surfactant. What is a surfactant? Surfactant, remember, is a surface active agent which reduces the surface tension present inside the alveoli. Okay, surfactant is a surface active agent which reduces the surface tension inside the alveoli. And yes, Titana, it is actually lecithin. You remember phospholipid? So lecithin, so it is lecithin. Understood? So that is, so hence we call this pneumocyte as a type 2 pneumocyte. This pneumocyte is called as type 2 pneumocyte. So naturally, the other pneumocyte which is present, that is called as type 1 pneumocyte. Okay, so there is type 1 pneumocyte who is providing mainly the structure, and type 2 pneumocyte is which is producing the surfactant. And you understand that they are all surrounded by these capillaries. Okay, they're all surrounded by these capillaries, isn't it? So that gaseous exchange can take place. Okay, so they are surrounded by capillaries, and here the exchange of gases take place. Now remember that uh, capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelium. Do you remember that? Hopefully, you will remember this. That capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelium. Okay, those of you who don't remember, read the epithelium wala chapter. So you will see that the capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelium, also known as endothelium. All right. So over here, remember one thing, that these endothelium, they are not floating on air. All right, they are not at all floating on air, but you understand that they must be floating on some basement membrane. Okay, they must be floating on some basement membrane. So remember, if any gas has to travel, so first it must travel through the alveolar epithelium, then it must travel through the basement membrane, and then it must travel through the endothelium. So these are the layers which our gas must travel. So this is called as the respiratory membrane. Okay, so respiratory membrane comprises of three layers. There is alveolar epithelium, there is basement membrane, and then there is capillary endothelium. Everybody understood? No confusion? People are there or keeping lecture on, gone for taking lunch. Acha, chalo, one person is there. Uh, Neha, the last one is endothelium, respiratory membrane. Okay, respiratory membrane. Acha, writing. Okay, respiratory membrane comprises of alveolar epithelium, Sushobon, alveolar epithelium, the blue one. Then in black color, I am representing the basement membrane. Okay, I am representing the basement membrane. And after that, in red color, I am representing the capillary endothelium. Okay. So, yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Written. Acha. Okay. So now, once you're done with this, so this is all about the structure. So structure part, no confusion, I guess. How the entire respiratory system is arranged uh, till their tissue level. Tissue level to the organ level, I think I have discussed the structure. Okay. So now we will start discussing about the function. So as far as the function is concerned, remember first thing we need to know that over here towards the end, let me tell you, after terminal thing, you will see there are present pyramidal lungs. That is not written over here, lungs. Okay, so pyramidal lungs over here present. Yes, so main one we missed. So lungs are present. So just let me clear out one thing here, that we have got one lung which is the right lung. and another lung is the wrong lung, isn't it? Opposite of right is wrong. So remember, opposite of right is left also. So it's the left lung. So you will see that in the left lung, there is present a fissure which is running obliquely. Okay, so in the right lung also, you will see such a fissure is running obliquely. So naturally, we will call it as oblique fissure. So we see in the left lung, the oblique fissure is dividing the lung into a superior lobe and the inferior lobe. And on the right lung, we have another fissure. Fissure, it's a groove. Another fissure which is running horizontally. So we call it as horizontal fissure. That means in simple language, the left lung has got an oblique fissure and the right lung has got oblique fissure and horizontal fissure. In the left lung, the oblique fissure is dividing the lung into superior lobe and inferior lobe, whereas the oblique fissure and the horizontal fissure is dividing the lung into superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. So three lobes will be present over here. So, and this notch which is present over here, it is known as the cardiac notch. So I think we are done with the structural aspect of it. Now let's talk about the functional aspect of it. So whenever we talk about the functional aspect, so we need to know that who supports this breathing process. So let me tell you some, let me give you some idea about the structures. All right, so let's go on to the next page. So here, okay, Samira is asking, do we need to know about the pleural layer? Yes, you can know about the pleural layer, and it's nothing complicated. It's very simple. I'll show you. See, pleura is basically the covering of the lung. So if you look at this lung, you will find that there is one layer passing like this, all right, and it is called as the visceral layer. And the line which is now I'm drawing, this is the parietal layer. Okay, and yes, and this space which they are enclosing, it is called as the intrapleural space. Okay, the space is called as intrapleural space, and it is filled with pleural fluid. Correct. So no confusion now. So chalo, pleura has also been discussed. Okay. Now let's talk about the functioning process, how the function takes place. So remember, imagine if this is our lung. Okay, if this is our lung, lung is the important, but what is even more important is the structures which are present surrounding. So the structures which are present over here, these are basically the cut section of the ribs. Okay, they are very important. Why? Because these ribs, they are connected to each other by something called as external intercostal muscles. Okay, as well as there are going to be internal intercostal muscles. So there are either external intercostal muscles or there are internal intercostal muscles, and these muscles, they where they end over there, there is present another thick muscle. It's very thick muscle. All right, there is present another thick muscle like this, and this muscle is called as the diaphragm. Okay, yes, it is called as the diaphragm. It is PHRAGM, diaphragm. Now over here, you will see that the part which works mainly is something which you have, but you might not be knowing it, so you don't use it. It is called as your beloved brain. Now, you will see there are certain neurons, all right, which arise from here, and they are going to supply the diaphragm. Okay, and whenever the amount of stimulus gets too much, then there is another fiber present from here which is going to supply these muscles as well. So question is, what is this? So this area from which the nerves arise, it is called as the respiratory rhythm center. Okay, it is called as respiratory rhythm center. Okay, yes, Bitan, it is present in the ventral area of medulla oblongata. Okay, not in pons, but it is present in medulla oblongata. It is called as respiratory rhythm center. So always remember, it gives stimulus for 3 seconds, and then, like, for 3 seconds it will give stimulus for breathing, and then for 2 seconds it will I'm so sorry for 2 seconds it will give a stimulus for breathing, and then for 3 seconds it is going to go silent. Okay, again 2 second breathing, again 3 seconds silent, again 2 second breathing, again 3 seconds silent. So in this way they will keep giving stimulus. So always remember that where is our main nerve going? You will observe that our main nerve is going primarily to the diaphragm. So always remember that silent breathing is only movement of diaphragm. Okay, in silent breathing there is present only movement of diaphragm. But whenever you perform conscious breathing, okay, suppose you are alert, awake, and you are breathing consciously. Suppose if some doctor has asked you to take some breathe in, breathe out exercise, so you're breathing consciously. Then over there you will see the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so these were the external intercostal muscles. So you will see the external intercostal muscles. They are getting activated and they work over there. So they contract over there. So you see, whenever these muscles will contract, you understand that the ribs will be lifted up. Okay, and when the ribs will be lifted up, and also another thing, remember that whenever the diaphragm will contract, diaphragm will go downward. So you see, when diaphragm goes downward or ribs are lifted up, so what do we see? We observe that the entire volume here, the volume is going to increase, and you know that when volume is going to increase, so naturally the pressure is going to decrease. And when the pressure will decrease, so air from outside is going to enter in. So this is the way breathing in or inspiration takes place. Okay, breathing in or inspiration takes place. Everybody understands this? So, okay. So this is the job of respiratory rhythm center. Now remember, sometimes whenever your respiratory rhythm center has given signal, okay, after 2 seconds, what happens? That breathing stops and it remains stopped for the next 3 seconds. What happens? Because something must be happening so that these things get stopped. The entire stimulus gets stopped. So remember, in the upper pons area, okay, in the upper pons area, there is present another area which is called as pneumotaxic center. Okay, not toxic, it is taxic. The pneumotaxic center. Now, this pneumotaxic center, it mainly controls the depth of respiration. Okay, pneumotaxic center mainly controls the depth of respiration, and this pneumotaxic center, when gets stimulated, it creates a stop sign. Okay, so pneumotaxic center is more like a switch off area. Whenever pneumotaxic center will get activated, uh, here it is going to switch it off. Okay, and this switch off will stay for 3 seconds, and after that, again, respiratory rhythm center will fire signal. Everybody understood the regulation process? No confusion with the regulation process? All right. So over here, now remember that if breathing in has taken place, then there must be some way in which breathing out is also taking place. Okay, so over here there are few more centers. Let me just finish this part. So you will see that there are some dorsal respiratory group, okay, who can give positive signal, and there is present a ventral respiratory group, and ventral respiratory group can give them positive signal as well as negative signal, as well as negative signal. Like pneumotaxic was giving negative signal. In the same way, they can give negative signal, but dorsal respiratory group will always give positive signal. So over here, I guess everybody is clear and thorough with this. So in case breathing in takes place, then there must be something called as breathing out also. So how does normally breathing out takes place? Just like that. Normally breathing out takes place just like that, SE, automatically. Okay, so breathing out takes place just like that in case of this expiration. So over here we call it as elastic recoil. It is just like that. If I ask you that if you are holding a rubber band and you are trying to stretch it, what will you have to do? You will say that I have to use my muscles to pull it. But then I will ask you that, okay, how will you bring back to its original configuration? For that, what you have to do? So there the answer is nothing. So same thing over here, all the muscles, lungs, they all have elasticity. They all act like elastic fibers. So for inspiration, you have to do so many things. But for expiration, you don't need to do much of the things. It will happen by elastic recoil process. That phenomena is called as elastic recoil. So, but in case you want to go for forced breathing, when you want to go for forced breathing, then remember, if you can understand this, that see, this is the chest area of you, but this area is the abdomen area. So what you have to do is, here also there are some muscles present. So if these muscles contract in the abdomen, then what will happen? Pressure over here will be more. Okay, and also here there is internal intercostal muscles present which will pull the ribs downward. So what is happening? Even if you look over here, even this one is pushing up, diaphragm is pushing up, ribs are also pulled downward. So what is happening to this entire thoracic volume? The entire thoracic volume is decreasing. Okay, so when the entire thoracic volume decreases, okay, you will find that when the thoracic volume decreases, so pressure by Boyle's law is going to increase, and when the pressure increases, then the air is going to go out, and this is the way forced expiration, yes, breathing out or forced expiration is going to take place. Clear, everyone? No confusion?
Please repeat it again.
Okay. Forced expiration is abdominal muscle contract. Okay. Diaphragm, because of that, diaphragm pushed upward. Okay. So thoracic volume decreases. Then I said internal intercostal contracts, ribs pulled down, thoracic volume decreases. Yes, Sushovan. Thoracic volume decreases even more. So pressure increases, air goes out. So I've given the written flowchart form. So who asked me, by the way, at that time? Did you understand?
Yes, sir.
Like completely have understood?
Yes, sir.
All right, Kirina. Fine. So over here, this is the process. This is the entire phenomena of breathing in and breathing out. So over here, remember that inspiration is active, but expiration is passive. But if somebody asks you about forced expiration, so forced expiration is again active. Inspiration is active, expiration is passive. But forced expiration is again active, because here muscles have to be contracted voluntarily. Okay, so this is the thing of breathing. Now remember, for breathing, there are a few more parameters. The method by which we check whether a person is breathing normally or not is called as, Arey yaar, it is called as spirometry. It's called as spirometry. So in spirometry, we consider that, imagine a person is breathing. So when a person is breathing, the graph goes in this way: breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. So the volume of air that the person is breathing in and the person is breathing out, okay, in single breath, the volume of air the person is breathing in and breathing out in a single breath is called as tidal volume. Okay, it is called as tidal volume. Whenever you will ask the person to breathe in deep breath, the person will do deep breath like this. And again, by virtue of elastic recoil, the person will be back over here. Okay, so if that happens, then this extra amount of thing that the person has breathed in, the extra volume of air the person has breathed in, this is called as inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, no, Akupro, this is called as inspiratory reserve volume. All right, and then suppose again the person is breathing, and then you ask the person to exhale deeply. So when the person will exhale deeply, so you will see that this person is showing this extra, again this extra volume. The person is exhaling this extra volume, and this is called as expiratory reserve volume. All right. Always remember, even beyond all these things, beyond all these volumes, some amount of air is always present in the lung, which is not measured in spirometry. That is why I'm using a different color. You cannot measure this volume of air present in the lung even after the person exhales the air completely. This volume of air, correct Pitan, it is called as residual volume. Okay, this is called as residual volume. All right, no Pitan, it's not capacity, it is called as residual volume. All right, so always remember, a combination of volume is called as capacity. All right, the combination of volume is called as capacity. So remember that if we talk about all the capacities that way, like this is the inspiration side, and we are combining two volumes over here, so we call it as inspiratory capacity. Okay, this is called as inspiratory capacity. Again, in the same way, if I combine these two volumes, okay, if I combine these two volumes, then same way you understand, it will be called as expiratory capacity. Okay, see, now you can define it in various ways. You can define in this way that, after a normal expiration, the total amount of air breathed forcefully, okay, after a normal expiration, the total amount of air breathed forcefully is the inspiratory capacity. And in the same way, you can say after a normal inhalation, the total amount of air which is exhaled forcibly, that is called as expiratory capacity. Okay, like if this is inspiratory capacity, you understand this is going to be expiratory capacity. Now remember, if I want to consider both, like this peak to this peak, then this is called as vital capacity. Okay, this capacity is called as vital capacity. So there is inspiratory capacity, there is a vital capacity, and there is a expiratory capacity. Now remember, if I consider the thing which cannot be identified by spirometry, okay, so these are hypothetical. Remember, if we combine expiratory reserve volume with residual volume, hypothetically, because you cannot find it by spirometry, but it is also a capacity. So this capacity, remember, so I'm changing the color over here because this cannot be identified by spirometry. Very good. Two people, Bitan has and Samira has already given the correct answer. It is going to be called as functional residual capacity. Okay, it is called as functional residual capacity. And after all these things, like all of these things, if we combine, that is, I combine the volume along with the residual volume. Yes, very good, Samira. This entire thing then will be called as the total lung capacity. Okay, so starting from here till the end of residual volume is known as total lung capacity. Yes, Sushovan. So I guess everybody has got this idea about spirometry. No confusion. Now, if you are clear with this, next thing remember that in case we are trying to talk about uh, say minute volume, okay, or minute ventilation. So minute ventilation is very easy to remember. It is ventilation, that means exchange of gas in a minute. So in a minute, how many times we breathe in? We breathe in 14 to 19 times. So that is only what you will learn in case of minute ventilation. So it is ventilation in a minute. That means in a minute, that means how many times you're breathing in and how much ventilation is taking place. So ventilation taking place in one breath is the tidal volume. If you remember, everyone, this is the ventilation going on in one breath, isn't it? So if I talk about ventilation in a minute, so what I have to do? Any idea? If I have to know ventilation in a minute and I know the tidal volume, then what I have to do? Any idea? Correct. So as many of you have understood that it should be multiplied by either 14 or 19. And that's right. So what we do is I write over here that it is tidal volume multiplied by frequency. So whatever the frequency of breathing that person will have, so that will be tidal volume multiplied by frequency. Everybody is getting? So do you think this is a very difficult formula to remember? Another formula is there, like for example, if we talk about alveolar ventilation. What is alveolar ventilation? This is also ventilation, but at the alveolar level. Now here I want you to remember something. Now if we can tamper this picture again. You see, everybody focus in this area where the anatomy was there. See, whenever we talk about the spirometric volume of air, that volume of air is coming from outside all this passage and then enter into the lung. And then exhalation takes place all this part and enter into the lung. This is what was shown in spirometry. Spirometry was taking the air from outside. Everybody understanding? In spirometry, the person was taking the air from outside. So if a person is taking 500 ml air, so how are we calculating 500 ml? It is the full volume of air from here to here, isn't it? Are you understanding? Yes or no? That when we say that the person is exhaling 500 volume of air, so how do we get to know it? From here till here. But when we say alveolar ventilation, it is ventilation only at the alveolar level. Whenever I say alveolar ventilation, so this was just ventilation, but here it is more specific. It is ventilation in the alveoli. So in the alveoli, do you think that inside the alveoli, uh, these, the air which is present all over here, from here to here, these air, they should play a role? They should be a part of calculation. What do you think? No. So remember, the volume of air, this particular volume of air, which I have shown in blue color. So remember the volume of air which do not participate in gaseous exchange. Okay. The volume of air which do not participate in gaseous exchange is called as dead space volume. Everybody understood? If the volume of, okay, the volume of air which do not participate in gaseous exchange is called as dead space volume. So here what do we do is, here it's even simple. We take the tidal volume, okay, that is the full amount of air which is being exhaled and inhaled, but we subtract from here something called as those dead space volume. So if you subtract the dead space volume from the tidal volume, do you understand? Now we are left with that amount of air which is present only here. Are you understanding this? Yes or no? If I subtract the total volume from this total volume, we subtract this volume which is only conducting, which is only present in the conduction passage, which is not participating in gaseous exchange. Then we will get the tidal volume, but at the alveolar level, at this level. Do you agree? All right. So remember, if you agree to this, so I can tell you that if we talk about alveolar ventilation, so we say it is tidal volume minus the excess volume, and rest of the thing remains same. That means this should be multiplied by frequency. Think and answer me that do you get my point? Yes or no? Okay. So see, these just looks like formula, but they are not at all some formula big deal. Okay, they're very simple stuff. It's just concept based. It is just based on your idea, understanding, logical. Okay. So once we are done with all these things, we know that how breathing takes place, how do we breathe in, what are the machines with which we can judge the breathing. Now we need to understand that what is the role of so much air in our body. Primarily, see, we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So how is this entering inside our body? So see, actually, what is oxygen doing in our body and how is carbon dioxide produced? That again, I told you, it will be discussed by your botany department. Okay, it is a part of botany. So I'm going to tell you, my job is to carry the gas, carry the oxygen, and take it till your tissue, and carry the carbon dioxide and take it till your lung. So that's my duty. So over here, remember, whenever we talk about oxygen, so you know that one molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. This you know. Another thing you must know here that another thing everybody must know over here, that is, remember, 15 grams of hemoglobin, okay, carries 1.34, okay, sorry, 1 gram hemoglobin, I'm so sorry, 1 gram hemoglobin, 15 grams, it's 1 gram hemoglobin carries 1.34 ml oxygen, okay, 1 gram hemoglobin carries 1.34 ml oxygen. And also remember that 100 ml blood contains 15 gram hemoglobin. Okay, so remember, if 100 ml blood contains 15 gram hemoglobin, number one, and number two is if 1 gram hemoglobin is carrying 1.3 ml, 34 ml of oxygen, okay, then hence remember that 100 ml blood will carry how many oxygen, you know? It should be 15 into 1.34 around. So it is approximately, you will see, 19.4 ml coming out. Okay, if you do some calculation, you will find that. So 19.4 ml oxygen is being carried to the tissue. So if there is a tissue, suppose I draw a tissue over here. Let's say there is a very beautiful tissue with nucleus and all. So when the blood goes in over here, it carries 19.4 ml oxygen. But when it is going to come out, okay, then it actually contains approximately 14.4 ml oxygen. So how much amount 100 ml blood carrying to the tissue? How much oxygen 100 ml blood carrying to the tissue? Anyone? 19.4 ml blood. 100 ml blood is carrying 19.4 ml oxygen to the tissue, and 100 ml, the same 100 ml blood is taking away 14.4 ml oxygen from the tissue. So how much oxygen has been taken up over here? Okay, Bitan says 19. What? Acha, 10 to 14.4. Acha. Sushovan says 5 ml. Very good, Sushovan. Bitan says 19 to 14.4. Acha, 19 minus, so 5 ml. So tell me directly, 5 ml. So I guess everybody understood it. 5 ml blood will be carried over here to the tissue. So remember, 100 ml blood carries 5 ml oxygen to the tissue. However, during exercise, you will see that this 14.4 ml gets converted into 4.4 ml. At that time, how much oxygen is taken up by the tissue carried by 100 ml blood during exercise? if there is a vigorous exercise going on. Yes. So remember, Devadrita has given correct answer that 15 ml. So remember that during exercise, our oxygen consumption increases threefold. Okay, during exercise, our oxygen consumption increases three times, threefold. Okay, so this is about the oxygen transport. Now remember, approximately 97% oxygen is carried in the dissolved form in plasma, and only 3% is there which is carried in the form of oxyhemoglobin. Okay, 97% blood is carried. Uh, just a sec. Okay, listen. So sorry. 97% blood, I just said it ulta. 97% oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin, and 3% is dissolved in plasma. Okay. In a hurry, I'm doing a lot of slip of tongue. 3% plasma, 97% hemoglobin. Understood? Nobody's confused here? Or everybody's confused now? Tell me. I getting acha, no confusion. Okay, fine. All right. So let's proceed ahead. So let's talk about now the carbon dioxide. For carbon dioxide, remember it is almost same thing. So here, Orko is saying that please discuss. I am discussing. So when we talk about carbon dioxide, remember 70% carbon dioxide is actually traveling in the form of bicarbonate ion. Okay, in the form of bicarbonate ion. And approximately you will see 23% is in the form of carboxyhemoglobin. Okay, it is called as carboxyhemoglobin, 23%, and 7% is in dissolved form. All right, so I'll just write over here for the oxygen as well so that nobody gets confused. So 97% is in the form of oxyhemoglobin, 3% in the dissolved form in plasma. All right, so this is for this, what do you say, carbon dioxide, this is for oxygen. Now let's understand that whenever we talk about this carbon dioxide, over here, see, in as far as hemoglobin is concerned, it will bind to the globin chain. Okay, this carbon dioxide will bind to the globin chain. Dissolved in plasma, there is nothing to discuss over there. As far as hemoglobin is concerned, so that I'll show you. So imagine this is a hemoglobin. This is a hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin, it is laden with oxygen. Okay, so when this hemoglobin came to the tissue, it is having large amount of oxygen. Okay, large amount of oxygen connected to our oxygen, sorry, of our hemoglobin molecule. Okay, so large amount of oxygen which are connected to our this hemoglobin molecule. Now remember that these are surrounded by tissue. Okay, because this is the hemoglobin passing through the tissue. So the tissues, they will release a large amount of carbon dioxide. Okay, so these tissues, they release a large amount of carbon dioxide. Now remember here water is already present. So carbon dioxide and water together is going to form carbonic acid. Okay, they will together form carbonic acid. Now this carbonic acid, it splits into two parts. There is a proton and there is a bicarbonate ion. Now this bicarbonate ion, it moves out into the plasma, and in lieu of that, a chloride ion is going to enter in. Okay, instead of bicarbonate ion, a chloride ion will be entering in. So chloride ion pushes in, bicarbonate ion moves out. Now this is called as chloride shift. This phenomena is called as chloride shift or Hamburger's phenomena. Okay, this is called as chloride shift or Hamburger phenomena. Now, if you observe over here that there is present free proton. Do you think free proton is good for our body? Neha, the second name is Hamburger phenomenon. I'll write it here. Hamburger phenomenon. Okay, so rest everyone, do you think that this proton present over here, this proton, free proton is good for us? What do you think? Do we want free proton to be present like that? Yes, Beetan, it's the name. No, free proton is bad, isn't it? So remember, what happens is, who will be acting as a buffer for this excess proton? It is going to be the hemoglobin. So what does it do? Remember that hemoglobin is going to throw away or release the oxygen. Okay, it will release the oxygen to the tissues and take up the protons. Okay, protons are taken up. So how do we know this? That these hemoglobins which were present, now they are laden with proton. So how do we know this? We know this because Bohr uncle told us this. There was an uncle called as Bohr, okay, who said that if the proton concentration is high, it displaces the oxygen from hemoglobin. Okay, if proton concentration is high, it displaces oxygen from hemoglobin. And this is called as Bohr's effect. Samir is asking, sir, is the carbaminohemoglobin present as well? What is the percentage? So carbaminohemoglobin is present over here. Today, what is happening? Today it seems I need a tea. Okay, guys, look over here. In this whiteboard only, I am cutting an area. And thanks, Samira, for pointing it out. You are right. Okay, and I made an error. It's called as, this type of error is called as requirement of T error. Samira, it was a mistake from my side. Okay, so I have actually shown it. It is carbaminohemoglobin. Okay, not carboxyhemoglobin. Everybody make correction. Are you getting it? Everybody, after doing correction, give me a check that you have understood or not. Okay, so carboxyhemoglobin, Samira, I made this error, and it is a error because carboxyhemoglobin is basically something which is produced when carbon monoxide binds. Okay, so carbon monoxide binds to the same place where oxygen is supposed to bind, and that is called as carboxyhemoglobin. Yes, Samira, it's of course deadly. Okay, so this is carbaminohemoglobin. This is also not good, but okay, not that deadly as that of carboxyhemoglobin. All right, so over here we get protonated hemoglobin, okay, because of Bohr's effect. So now, where is our carbon dioxide? Our carbon dioxide is right now in the plasma. Do you understand? Here is our carbon dioxide in the plasma in the form of bicarbonate ion. Now, when it reaches the lungs, okay, suppose a time comes up when it is going to reach the lungs. Okay, this is the lungs, suppose. And in the lungs, there is present this again RBC. And this time the RBC that has reached over here, I guess you understand, here the hemoglobin is protonated. It is protonated hemoglobin, HB or H plus HB, you can write it in that way. So this is present over here. Now remember, here the oxygen partial pressure is very, very high. Okay, partial pressure of oxygen, it is the lungs, right? So partial pressure of oxygen is very, very high. So what happens is, whenever, remember, the partial pressure of oxygen is very, very high, oxygen displaces proton from hemoglobin. Okay, oxygen displaces proton from hemoglobin and gets converted into oxyhemoglobin. Okay, gets converted to oxyhemoglobin. Now, if I show you this arrow, do you get the cycle? See, now we are learning that this RBC has reached from here to here. But with the arrow, if I show you that this is the oxyhemoglobin whose story we started over here. Now, are you getting my point? Yes or no? All right. And remember, for this, you don't need to believe in me. I am not saying anything. There was this another person called as Halden uncle, and Halden uncle actually said this type of bad stuff. Okay, that whenever the partial pressure of oxygen increases, it tends to displace proton from hemoglobin, leading to formation of oxyhemoglobin. This is called as Halden's effect. Okay, not Dr. Utsav's effect. It is called as Halden's effect. So Halden's effect is when the partial pressure of oxygen increases, it tends to displace the proton from hemoglobin. Okay. So over here, do you observe this, that again our proton is getting free? Do you observe this, that again our proton is getting free? So do you think it's good for the RBC or bad for RBC? Is good for RBC, bad for RBC? What do you think? Okay, so we have to get rid of this again. So how can it be done? So over here, you remember that bicarbonate which was roaming around here and there in the streets. Now that bicarbonate will go in, and this bicarbonate enters over here from the plasma to this RBC. This is the bicarbonate ion. Now bicarbonate ion is going to join with the proton, giving rise to 2H and 1O plus what is left, C and 2O. So you understand that this carbon dioxide which was hidden now is going to get released. This phenomena, so you see when bicarbonate is going in, do you realize that the chloride must be shifting out? Do you understand that now the chloride must shift out because bicarbonate has gone in? So this phenomena is called as reverse chloride shift. Okay, this phenomena is known as reverse chloride shift. You understand the chloride shift and reverse chloride shift, Halden's effect and Bohr's effect? Yes or no? Okay, fine. So some people says that you have understood it already, so no confusion. So technically, my job is done, but I just finish it by telling you a few factors over here related to the oxygen part. Acha, one more thing over here. One point is missing. Do you see that during formation of oxyhemoglobin, there is release of proton? During formation of oxyhemoglobin, there is release of proton. So remember, oxyhemoglobin is acidic in nature. Okay, always remember, oxyhemoglobin is acidic in nature. So we are done in basics. Briefly, I have explained to you about the entire respiration chapter. So I'll just tell you one last thing for today. That is when this is the relationship of oxygen with hemoglobin. So remember, if we talk about the partial pressure of oxygen, I'll put it here. Let's say this is the, okay, fine, let it be partial pressure of oxygen. And let's say on this axis, I show percentage of hemoglobin saturation. Okay, percentage saturation of hemoglobin or percentage of hemoglobin saturation. So you will observe that we get a sigmoid curve over here. Okay, the curve that we get, that is sigmoid curve. Now, this is for hemoglobin, but this is not true for myoglobin. For myoglobin, you will see, so this is going to be partial pressure of oxygen again, same thing, and this is myoglobin percentage saturation. So here you will see that the curve comes out to be a rectangular hyperbola. Okay, the graph is a rectangular hyperbola for myoglobin versus oxygen and a sigmoid curve in hemoglobin versus oxygen. Now remember, there are a few factors, like if there is increased partial pressure of I'll write it in this way. In case there is partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or if there is a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, or if there is increased proton concentration, okay, or if there is an increased temperature. All right. So in all these cases, you will see the curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, in all these cases, the curve will shift to the right. Okay, and naturally you understand if there is a decreased PCO2, if there is increased PO2, if there is decreased proton concentration, okay, if there is lower temperature, then you understand that the curve should have shifted towards the left. So there's going to be a left shift of the curve. Everybody getting it? Now remember, for left shift of the curve, left shift of curve also occurs in case of fetal hemoglobin. Remember, in case of fetal hemoglobin also, the curve shifts to the left. So I guess everybody understands what is this left shift, right shift, because see, correlated with the enzyme wala chapter. You remember, suppose this is 100% saturation. So if this is 100% saturation, so naturally this is going to be 50% saturation. So if this is 50% saturation, you may understand that that partial pressure of oxygen, okay, that partial pressure of oxygen, okay, at which 50% of saturation of hemoglobin can be obtained, we call it as what? P50 value. So in case of right shift, do you understand that the P50 value is shifting? So in case of increased PCO2, in case of decreased PO2, in case of increased proton concentration, increased temperature, you will see that the P50 value has increased. Okay, same over here. You will find that this is the P50 value in case of low PCO2, high PO2, or low proton concentration, low temperature. So you will see that there is a lowering of the P50 value. So here P50 value is getting lower value. So you will see that more on the righter side, more you keep going on the right side. Okay, this side you keep moving, you will find that it is more of dissociating in nature. More you shift towards the left hand side, you see hemoglobin is more associating in nature. On the left hand side, hemoglobin is binding with oxygen easily, and on the right hand side, hemoglobin is not binding with oxygen easily. Everybody understood this? Yes or no? Tell me that. All right. So this is called as oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So I guess everybody understood, starting from the anatomical structures of respiration to the methodology to find out breathing, and then when the gases enter in, then over there how the gases are transported. I should repeat this area. Titina, remember, more you move on the righter side, okay, more you move towards the right side, it is more, the oxygen is more breaking off. See, try to understand this. High P50 value. P50 value high means to reach 50% saturation, pressure of oxygen must be more. High P50 value bole to, for reaching the same 50% saturation, pressure of oxygen now required is more. That means what? Here hemoglobin Titirna wants to bind with hemoglobin or does not wants to bind with hemoglobin? Tell me that rapidly. Here hemoglobin wants to bind with oxygen, or here hemoglobin does not want to bind with oxygen? Tell me that. Here, remember, hemoglobin does not want to bind with oxygen. That is why you have to jabardasti put more pressure and make them bind. But when we say that with a very little, partial pressure of oxygen, very little partial pressure of oxygen, you reach the same 50% saturation. Okay, with very little partial pressure of oxygen, you reach the same 50% saturation. That means here hemoglobin wants to bind with oxygen, or hemoglobin does not want to bind with oxygen. So remember, here hemoglobin wants to bind with oxygen, isn't it? So now you understand this, that if PO2 is high, so of course hemoglobin will bind to oxygen, na? So it will shift to the left. If PCO2 is high, then hemoglobin is not binding with oxygen, so it will shift to the right. Clear? Okay. Then comes up Devodip's question: why HbF shifts left? Actually, Devodip, always remember that whenever we talk about our hemoglobin, so it is called as basically adult hemoglobin. Adult hemoglobin has got 2 alpha, 2 beta configuration. But whenever we talk about fetal hemoglobin has got 2 alpha and 2 gamma configuration. So you see alpha is same. So इसकी बात नहीं कर रही. Now let's discuss what is the difference between beta and gamma. So always keep this thing in mind that beta chain, okay, beta chain binds more towards to a compound, a respiratory compound. You don't have this pathway in your syllabus. It is basically a shunting pathway. It is called as 2,3-diphosphoglycerate. Okay, beta chain has got a very high affinity for 2,3-diphospho-glycerate. What is 2,3-diphospho-glycerate? It is basically a compound which is produced as a shunting pathway, which is produced as a byproduct. Okay, so gamma chain has got less affinity towards 2,3-DPG. Okay, gamma chain has got very less affinity towards 2,3-DPG. Now remember, Devodip, very carefully, 2,3-DPG, if binds to hemoglobin, oxygen will not bind to hemoglobin. Okay, if in a hemoglobin, let's say if 2,3-DPG binds over here, okay, then oxygen will never bind over here. So by looking at this situation, Devodip, can you tell me who should have more affinity, gamma or beta for oxygen? Who should have more affinity for oxygen, gamma chain or beta chain? Tell me, Devodip. Titrina, what did I say just now? I said that if hemoglobin, look over here, if hemoglobin is attached to, Devodip, look over here. I am saying if hemoglobin is attached to 2,3-DPG, can oxygen come up and bind? Can oxygen come up and bind? No, right? So I am saying beta chain has more affinity towards 2,3-DPG. Beta chain has more affinity towards 2,3-DPG. Gamma chain has got less affinity towards 2,3-DPG. So who will have more affinity towards oxygen? Who will have more affinity towards oxygen? Correct. So Devajit has given correct answer. Adrij has given correct answer. Neha has given correct answer. Titrina and Devodip, waiting for you people. Okay. So Devodip, have you understood that it is going to be which chain to have higher affinity? Correct. So you understand gamma chain will have higher affinity to oxygen. Now you understand why HbF shifts the curve to the left. Do you understand? Everybody understood this entire respiratory system? Okay, chalo, fine. So today's time is also over. Okay, so let's stop over here today, and next class we'll start with the circulation. Okay. All right, chalo. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.